Hey guys, as you join in, please let me know if you can hear me clearly. Just need to make sure the microphones are working properly. Hey Sachin, can you hear me off the microphones? Hey Amit, good morning. Good to see you on the stream. Awesome, thank you. Hey Arshad, good to see a lot of people joining already. So as usual, we'll take this time to answer any questions. If you have questions about the last few sessions, I will do a summary before we start next the topics for this week. But if you have any suggestions or do you have any questions about the previous sessions or any general photography queries, you can. This is a good time to ask. Just because we're not starting anything yet, we'll take 15 minutes to start. And just as a general thing, there's a pretty significant lag between when I see your question, when you ask your questions, and when I respond to them. That's a problem. Well, it's not really a problem. It's just something that happens when I use the software I'm using to do the streaming. It's called OBS. And when I use that software, it does introduce a bit of a lag. It's almost 35 or 40 seconds. So please excuse me if I don't answer your questions immediately. It's not intentional. It's just that the software doesn't allow me to do it. Yeah, no, 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 no. Okay, sit there, sit there, sit here, sit. Hey, no, sit here. Okay. Vidyadhar asks, what's the difference between macro photo and close-up photo, or is there a difference? So, macro photos and so macro photography generally has a very specific definition, right? So, macro photography, things are considered to be macro photography. As I explained in one of my last sessions, let me just put up the whiteboard. Um, it's considered to be a macro photograph when you have, let me see where that is. Yeah, here it is. When you have 1:1 reproduction, right? So this is what's called a macro photograph. When you have 1:1 reproduction, by 1:1 reproduction, it means that if an object is 1 centimeter long, it should form a 1 centimeter image on the sensor, right? So if it's a 36 by 24 sensor, it should form a 1 centimeter image there. That's considered to be the start of macro photography, or a macro lens is supposed to meet that definition. Close-up photography can be somewhat more generic. Close-up photography can be just any form of any kind of magnification, right? So it doesn't have to be this kind of extreme magnification. Hey, thanks, Aditya. Soumitra, good to see you here. Just seeing if there are any more questions. We still have 10 minutes to go, so it's a really good time for everyone to ask questions. Because some of my 10 minutes will be spent fighting off Leia. She's just sitting behind the camera right now, ready to strike. Okay, with the other. So just again, for everyone's information, as soon as this session is over, today is Wednesday, so as soon as this session's over, I'm going to be uploading all the previous sessions, including this one, onto YouTube. Again, I really want to thank Andy and Rahul for helping me out with that. So the sessions will be up on YouTube. It'll be much easier for you to watch them. I think it's a much better platform for just viewing videos, of course, rather than doing it through Facebook Live. So once it's up, I'll post links to it on my Facebook page and also post links on it on Instagram. Uh, Aditya says sometimes I face focus hunting issue with 750 and 85 mm 1.4 art. So we're going to talk a little bit about autofocus today. So autofocus is a fairly complicated topic. We're going to just do it surface level, but I think most of your problems will get solved by just the session today. Indrajit asks, what's the difference between macro lenses and close-up lenses in terms of functionality? Generally, nothing, but by definition, macro lenses need to meet the 1:1 requirement, right? They need to have 1:1 reproduction. Close-up lenses are not that's not a real technical term. So there's a technical definition for a macro term, but there's no real technical definition for a close-up lens. A close-up lens can be a macro lens, a macro lens can be a close-up lens. You could use those words interchangeably, but that's only because close-up lens is not like a real technical term. Parag asks, do these multiple focusing points actually help, or is it a marketing gimmick? It does help, but like most things, there's context behind it. So if you're a landscape photographer, it generally doesn't help too much. You don't really need it because you don't need it. Most of the times, it's pretty easy to work around just having that limitation of one focus point. If you're a portrait photographer or if you use fast lenses like Aditya uses an 85 1.4, yeah, then the multiple focus points really help. Hey, Keval, good to see you, huh? What's it been? Almost 28 years now? All right. Is there a limit on max print size with 24 megapixel raw images? Anurag asked that question. Why high megapixel is really needed for what we have when we have a Nikon D850? All right. So that's a good question, Anurag. So let me get to the print size first. So I'm just going to show you something. I don't know if it will show up clearly on this. Let me just show it to you. So this is a photo I got from Suhas. This is a print of Suhas's photo. So I really like this photo of his, so I purchased this from him. So it's a really beautiful print on canvas. Now this is, I'd say that's almost 3 feet by 2 feet. It's a 3 feet by 2 feet print. Now that print was made on a 5D Mark II, I think. Right, so 5D Mark II at that time was considered to be very high resolution, but it is only 21 megapixels. So a 21 megapixel camera is more than sufficient to make a 3 by 2 print. I also have other prints on my wall made by a Nikon D700. So the Nikon D700 is 12 megapixels, but it's still fine for print. So the thing about printing is it's a complicated topic. The the resolution limit doesn't really impact the print size. There are many factors. So the print size is important. The viewing distance is even more important. So if you're going to view a print up close, that's when you need the resolution. Or if you're going to make a print very large with high detail, that's when you need resolution. But if you're going to print something for normal viewing distance, so for example, in Drishtikon or all our exhibitions, we had a wide range of resolutions. People have printed from as low as 10 megapixels to as much as my cameras are 45 megapixels. So for me, there are two reasons why I shoot a high megapixel body. One reason is it's like having a free teleconverter on my lens. It's like having free magnification. I can crop in and still get 24 megapixels and still have a lot of detail. So I can carry smaller lenses, right? I don't need to carry a 300 mm lens. I can carry a 200 mm lens and then crop in, right? So that's why I shoot a more high megapixel body. As far as larger prints go, I'm obsessed with high resolution because eventually I want to start making extremely large prints. So that entire process was inspired by a friend of mine named Ben. So because of that, I started to get into this idea of making or figuring out the technical difficulties of making really high megapixel prints. But that's a completely different thing. For most people, 24 megapixels is more than enough for anything you'd need. Oh, I hope I answered the question. Hey, Anika. Yes, they're being recorded. They're all on Facebook, on my Facebook page, but they're all going to go onto YouTube as well soon. And apologies if I seem a little distracted. Leia's in the room with me, so she will be climbing around. You might see her every once in a while. And for people who, just to clarify, Leia's my cat. So, Anil Anand asked, what do you say about 1DX Mark III, compare N9? So I haven't used both of those cameras. I'm sure both will be fine. Uh, so here's the deal, right, Anil? A lot of people keep asking the question about, is camera A better than camera B? No, that's not the right question. The question is, are you capable of using the differences between camera A and camera B? Is your photography skill good enough to even be able to distinguish the difference between those two cameras? And I'd say for 99% of people, you're not up there, right? It's these cameras, these tools are extraordinarily robust. They're incredible tools. The tools are so good that 99% of the time, the camera is going to have more capabilities than you're able to exploit, right? So don't think too hard about it. You should see if there are specific features that a camera has that you need, right? So if it has those features, that's when you should consider that camera. And that's not available in the camera that you're currently using. Mani asks, how's my cat doing? You'll see her very soon. I'm sure she'll come make a guest appearance very soon. Lakshmikant asks, what's my opinion about the EOSR system? So now that system I have some familiarity about. I've actually used the EOSR for a wedding a couple of times. I like it. I think it's great. The lenses are amazing. It's good. It's easy to use. The ergonomics are very good. I don't like the sliding touch bar in the back, but that's personal preference. Yeah, so it's a good system. No complaints. If you're a Canon user, the EOS R is a really good camera. It's basically a cheaper 5D Mark II. Sorry, a cheaper 5D Mark IV. Vinayak asks, how about taking five vertical overlapping each other and making it a bigger frame? Yeah, that's right. So you can definitely do that. You can shoot a high resolution photo by just making a panorama. So Vidya, there is a lot of times for compositions, what's the story you want to convey? What goes on the mind, the psyche of a photographer? So that's the hardest question we have to ask with Vidya. So this is a question that we all have to struggle with at all the time. Uh, it's a struggle even for me to answer that question. I can't answer that question confidently myself. So I'm going to talk about it and give you my insight about this in another session. And I also have a plan of talking to other photographers who I really like and people who I'm friends with. And I'm going to bring them on into these sessions. And we're going to talk not about the technical stuff, but we're going to talk about our understanding of photography as a medium and how we use it to express ourselves. So there's an entire series of talks we're going to do about this stuff. So I think that will answer your question more. Lashmikant asks, which company is providing the best dynamic range? Okay, technically right now Nikon and Sony have the best dynamic range. Canon has slightly less. But if I give you files from both those cameras, you will not be able to tell the difference, right? So that's what practically matters. If I give you a file from a Canon 5D Mark IV, if I give you a file from EOS R, a Nikon Z6, Nikon D750, it's very difficult to tell the difference. A lot of times I can't tell the difference and I'm really familiar with it. Good to see all of you. Parag says, where's my wedding portfolio? So my wedding portfolio is, some of it is because I'm very lazy about this stuff. Let me just show you some of my wedding photo. So I have two Instagram profiles. One is Ram underscore Balmur, and very confusingly, the other one is Ram Balmur. without a space. So my wedding stuff is on the second one. Okay. Some people say that double multiple exposure is not photography, it's a digitally created product. Vinayak, everything's a digitally created product, right? Whenever something goes into Photoshop, whenever you take the raw file, even the act of taking the raw file and opening it up in Lightroom is changing the rendering of the file, the intent of the file. So if you say that multiple exposures are a digitally created product, then even a single exposure is a digitally created product. I feel like as photographers, we're too dogmatic about what constitutes photography. There were multiple exposures even in film photography. So did we say that's not photography? No, it's perfectly valid. It's a creative medium. You should feel free to create. You should do whatever you want. You should feel free to express yourself in whatever way you want. Art is meant to free you. Art is meant to liberate you. Art's not meant to put you inside a box. Right? So I find that pretty problematic. Why is it also confusing? Believe me, I'm trying to answer that question myself. How do you build a workfolio or website? So that's two separate parts of it. For websites, there are some great website builders. There's some great website builders like I use Format, but there's Squarespace. People use there are a bunch of tools. Selecting photos for the portfolio is like a different and more complicated conversation. Okay, so it's 11 o'clock, so let's not waste too much time. Let's just get started. Okay, so I have a special presentation for everyone. So I'm just going to start with that first. Let me just set that up for you. Okay, it's a special presentation, and it's before we get to the main topic, and it's near and dear to my heart. So I feel like we'll all get a lot of value out of this. So let me just bring that up here. Leah, no, 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 Leah, no, calm down. Just give me 1 second to get this set up. Okay. Um, yeah. Sorry, just give me 1 second to get all this organized. All right, and okay, we are good to go. All right, so this is my special session for today. I hope you enjoyed. This is the session we're going to use to get familiar with a very important topic before we move on to autofocusing and sensors. So today we're going to be talking about CATS 101. Okay, so we're going to start with history. So this is a cat. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with cats, but this is one of them. This is a pretty typical example of a cat. This is a female cat. When this photo was taken, this cat was about 8 or 9 years old. Right? So it's just important for us to be very familiar with the cat. And to really appreciate cats, we need to understand the history of a cat, and we are going to do it through the lens of this particular cat. This particular cat's name is Leia. Right, so let's talk a little bit about cat history. So cat history is uh, really important. So in order to appreciate the impact something has had, you must understand where it's come from. So in this case, we're going to look at the history of Leia. This is Leia circa 2009. So she was a very tiny kitten, brought in from the mean streets of Pune, had a rough life, and then had was brought in from a rescue shelter into a very loving home. This is her in 2014. As you can see, a cat in its natural environment. So again, it's really important to understand the technical details of what the cat is doing right now. As you can see, she's reclined in a very calm and peaceful position. So this is indicative of a cat that is a very trusting animal at this point in time. If you have any questions, please put them up on the live stream. This is Leia as of 2009. And of course, there's a live version of Leia running around right now disturbing me. But this is her in 2009. You can see how there's been improvement in the process, right, over these many years. You can see how her skills have improved in pure relaxation. She's turned relaxation into an art form. So she's gone from being somewhat more agitated to further relaxed to completely relaxed by 2019. So the thing I'm trying to tell you, the thing I'm trying to convey here is that relaxation is an art form. It takes hard work, it takes practice to get this. Right? And she is the best proponent of that art form I have seen till date. cat controls. Moving on to cat controls. Now, this is a important and somewhat more controversial topic, right? I'm just going to see, uh, just go back to the presentation here. So this is the first slide for cat controls. If you think you're seeing a blank screen, that's intentional. This is the first slide. As you can see, there are several ways to control a cat. They're all on the screen right now. This is slide 2. Again, many more ways about how to control a cat. And actually, realistically, there's no way to control a cat. This very inspirational and motivational quote is from me about how to control cats. So sorry about that. It's April 1st, and I couldn't let this opportunity pass. So I actually took a few minutes to make a presentation for it. Right. So now let's actually really get started. Let me pull up the proper presentation. Just give me 1 second. All right. Sorry about that, guys. I had to do that. It's just awfully tempting to try that today. All right. So let's get serious. Let's get to our main topic for today. Just put that on the screen. Okay. Hey, one. So cat fights are for later. That's out of syllabus for us. I'm sure your wife will be very happy to explain cat fights to you. Right. So let's keep that as an offline discussion. All right. So I'm just going to get. Oh, I don't know if you saw that, but that was Leah contributing to this presentation. Right. Let's get this started. All right. Now, before we get started on the actual camera control section, believe me, there are no more presentations about cats right now. That was the last presentation we'll see today. Leia, okay. Sorry guys, I'm going to have to move Leia out of the room. She is causing a huge ruckus here. Just going to get her out. All right. Sorry. She probably was not very amused about the presentation. Okay, so before we get to camera controls, I just want to do a quick review of what we discussed last time. Right. So as always, we do a quick review. So let's talk about what we did last time. So uh, all right. So just very basically, the first few sessions we went over exposure. So everyone's very familiar with this, right? Stops, underexposure, overexposure. We're all very familiar with this. Then we went over the ideas of shutter speed and then aperture. And we also discussed how shutter speed and aperture are both used primarily to control the exposure. The exposure meaning the brightness, and of the brightness of the photo. Colloquially, that's how we refer to exposure. And more importantly, how to convey the missing dimensions in a photograph, which is depth and which is time. So we use these as creative tools as well. And a lot of you had very important questions about how to use aperture and shutter speed to control depth of field and such. And a lot of you reached out to me offline. So I hope it's clear to everyone before we move on. So now we basically know the fundamentals, right? We basically know the core of the technical stuff that we need to know to move on to making it more specific. So we're going from the more general stuff, such as why do we use aperture? Uh, what is aperture and shutter speed? Sorry, excuse me. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Ah, yeah. So we went from that, and now we're going to go into how to actually implement that stuff on a camera itself, right? So let's go. Let's start talking about that. All right. So all your cameras primarily have 4 modes. So these modes which I put up on the screen are common for all cameras, right? They're common for any kind of camera that you might find. I think I have a slide to show that. So they're basically 4 modes. There's a P mode, the programmable automatic mode, the A mode, which is the aperture priority mode, the S mode, which is the shutter priority mode, and the M mode, which is the full manual mode. So these four modes exist in almost all cameras. My cell phone actually has the same camera, the same features as these modes, right? So I just got a picture here. Sorry, I'm a little distracted. I have cat hair in my nose now, so I'm getting an allergy. So if you see on the screen, these are three major camera manufacturers and the modes that they have on their cameras. So on the left side, you can obviously see it's a Sony. So the Sony has the same P, A, S, and M modes. The Nikon on the top right has the same P, S, and M modes. Canon, of course, does things a little differently. They call it the P, TV, AV, and M mode. And essentially, they're all the same thing. So what are these modes? And I'll just show you live that my Nikon Z6 also has the same modes. Just block my face so it'll focus. Right, so you can see the P, S, A, and M modes on my camera as well. Okay, so now let's talk about these modes. So what are these modes? So the P mode is called the programmable auto mode. Right, and what does that mean? It means the camera controls. Actually, let me just draw this as a grid so it's a little easier to see. Right, so this, let's call this the P mode. And what does the camera control? Right, so the camera in P mode controls the aperture and controls the shutter speed. You can control the ISO, you can control when the flash pops up. This is different from the automatic mode. If you look in, if you see that there's a green automatic mode represented like it looks like this, and it generally has a thing at the camera here, and it says auto, right? So I call this the green box mode. So that's different from the P mode. The green box mode is completely automatic. It controls the focusing mode, it controls the aperture, controls the shutter speed, controls the ISO. So you have very little agency in this. You can't select what you want in this, right? So the P mode is a little better than that. The P mode gives you aperture and shutter speed control and ISO control if you choose, right? So you can control aperture, shutter speed, and wait, sorry. The in P mode, the camera controls the aperture, the camera controls the shutter speed. You can control the ISO, right? You control the ISO if you want to. You can set it to auto ISO if you want, not necessary. Okay, so now let's go on to A mode. So what is the A mode? The A mode is aperture priority. And I'm going to demo all these modes for you in a second. It'll all make sense once I just demo it once. So sorry for something. So in the A mode, the camera controls. So remember, this is aperture priority. What does aperture priority mean? Aperture priority means you decide the aperture. The camera can control whatever else it wants, right? So what does the camera control in this? In aperture priority, the camera controls shutter speed and may control ISO. If you set it to auto ISO, may. You can actually control the ISO as well, right? So then the next mode is shutter priority mode. Shutter priority mode. Now, what is shutter priority mode? Shutter priority mode is a mode in which you control the shutter speed. The priority is given to you to control the shutter speed. The camera will control the aperture and may control the ISO if you set the camera to auto ISO. So in this mode, the camera controls the aperture and you control the shutter speed and it may control the ISO or you can control the ISO. And then you have full manual mode, right? Full manual mode. Full manual mode, the camera controls nothing. The camera doesn't control the aperture. It does not control the shutter speed. It may control the ISO if you set it for auto ISO, but generally it does not control the ISO either, right? So you have a mode in which you can decide the aperture. The camera takes care of everything else, which is aperture priority. You control the shutter speed. The camera takes care of everything else, shutter priority. Or you control aperture and shutter speed and ISO, and the camera does none of those. None of the. It does calculations for you to tell you what's right, but it does not, it absolutely does not feed in that information or actually make you shoot in that way, right? So those are different modes, and I'm just going to demo it for you. So now I'm actually going to take the camera off the tripod. the camera that you're looking at me on. And when I do that, it's going to look a little strange. So please bear with me. Okay, so I'm just going to have to get up and change it to photo mode. And I'm going to change this to photo mode. All right, so now you can see the complete overlay of my camera screen. Right, so this is the overlay of my camera screen. It will not even focus for me right now until I press a button. So forget about the focusing part. Now I'm going to take the camera off the tripod. Okay, so it's in my hand right now. So it's going to look a little weird, but you'll figure it out. All right. So right now the camera is set for aperture priority, and you can see that with the big A on the top right, on the top left corner. Now watch this. Okay. So I'm going to change this to manual ISO. It was set for auto ISO. Right. So now I'm on manual ISO for aperture priority. So notice what I want you to do is keep track of the shutter speed. Okay. So as I change the aperture, the camera will start reducing the shutter speed, right? That's because the camera is trying to get me exactly the same exposure that you see on screen right now, right? So if it's in aperture priority mode, remember aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, these are all automatic modes. So it's the camera is going to try and give you a decent exposure or what exposure it thinks is right. So if I just point it out of the window, right? Now the exposure is actually correct for the window. I can see out of the window. I'll just focus the camera, right? I can see out of the window, but I can't see anything on the foreground. Right, so that's a different problem, and we'll get to that problem shortly. But now just notice, as I change the aperture, the camera is automatically adjusting the shutter speed. Right? So this is how aperture priority works. It prioritizes the aperture and adjusts everything else accordingly. So now I'm just going to switch over to shutter priority. You can see the big S on the top right, the top left corner. So now I can change the shutter speed. So you can see that if I'm at 1 by 250. So what's one stop down at 1 by 250? It's 1 by 500. So if I go to 1 by 500, that means that the camera is stopping down by one stop. That means to get the same exposure, the aperture has to stop up by one stop. So when I go to 500, the camera should actually give me an aperture of f2.8. So let's see if that works, right? Exactly right. So our calculations are perfect. So let's go the other way. So if I start at 1 by 250 and I go to 1 by 125, right? By the principle of equivalent exposure, once I go from 1 by 250 to 1 by 125, the aperture should stop down. So it should go from f4 to f5.6 roughly, right? It went to 6.3 because we're not exactly right. It's varying a little bit between those two things, right? So this is the idea between changing the shutter speed in S mode, changing the aperture in A mode. And now let's go to M mode, the manual mode. Right? This is the full manual mode. Now you can see immediately the photo is a little overexposed. And next to that, next to my aperture, you can see a +2, right? You can see a +2 reading there. So what does that +2 mean? The +2 means that for this given combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, the camera thinks I'm going to get a two-stop overexposed photograph, right? If I point it down, it's going to say minus. It's going to say it's too dark. If I point it up, it's going to say it's too bright. Now, all your cameras have the same thing. All, all the cameras have the same thing. So I see your questions coming about how it's making this calculation, and I'll get to that as soon as I finish this part of it. So now watch this. Okay, so it's saying +2. So it's saying it's two stops overexposed at a minimum. So how do I fix this problem? I have to stop down something by two stops. So I'm going to stop down the shutter speed by two stops. Right? So now it's proper. Now the exposure is correct. I can take a photograph and I'll get a reasonably well exposed photo. Now if I point it down, it's going to be really dark. And it's saying -2 and it's flashing -2. What does it mean when it flashes -2? When it's flashing, it means that the photo is so overexposed, it's more than two stops overexposed. Sorry, it's so underexposed that it's more than two stops underexposed. So I need to at least open it up by two stops, right? So this is one stop, this is two stops. It's still showing -2. That means it's still too dark. and layer is just going to cross right in front of the camera. Layer, no, go that way. Go, 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 go. There's a question there. Go. Okay, so now we can just use layer as a subject. Okay, so now it's showing, let's see what it's showing. It's showing -2, so I still need to stop up, right? It's still showing -2, so I still need to stop up. Now I'm 1 by 30, and this is like this is a really low shutter speed, right? I can barely shoot this. I'm at 1 by 30. I'm at f2.8. This is an f2.8 lens, so it can't get any bigger. The aperture can't get any larger. So what am I left with? The only thing I'm left with is ISO, right? So I'm just going to change the ISO. I'm going to go from 1 by 100 to 1 by 200, and now I have a reasonably well exposed photo, right? So this is reasonably well exposed. So that's how this works. So that's how these things work. And of course, if you want to see P mode, that's P mode. You notice it's constantly varying everything, right? I'm not doing anything, but it's going to change everything. So the camera is controlling both the aperture and the shutter speed to make sure that it gets a well exposed image. Right? So now I'm going to just put the camera back. So let me just put that back there. Just going to put it back on the tripod so we can have a little talk about this now. I hope I don't drop it. Oh, this is tough. Yeah, I think we're good. Okay. All right, so I'll just bring up the whiteboard again. So now I'm going to take a few minutes and answer any questions you might have about this. Now remember, these features are there in all cameras. These features are there even in a lot of cell phone cameras when they have a pro mode. If you have a pro mode on your camera, it's there in that mode as well. Right? So uh, yeah, so it's available in most modes and in most cameras. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and answer any questions that you may have about this. So please feel free to ask any questions you have about the modes. So can you just rephrase the question? I'm not sure what the question means. So just ask me that question again. But I just don't understand what you're trying to ask me. Sorry. Niranjan asks, if in A mode ISO is set to auto, what algorithm does the shutter use to set the ISO and the shutter? So there are two parts to this. One part of this is uh, one part of this whole thing is what is the algorithm it's using to figure out the brightness of the photo, right? And that's from metering, right? So if you recall from our last sessions, there are different types of metering modes, right? There are different metering modes. We had spot, we had center weighted, we had evaluative or matrix, right? We had these modes. So these are the modes, or these are the algorithms it uses, and all of these are making the same 18% gray calculation. But they're using that data in different ways to give you what it considers to be the right exposure, right? So the right exposure is, of course, subjective, but that's what the camera thinks is the right exposure. So think about it this way. So let's say the camera thinks there's a particular exposure which is correct, and you're in A mode. The camera will vary the shutter speed, and if you're in auto ISO, it'll vary the ISO to make sure you at least get the aperture that you want. Right? So if you're shooting in a dark scene and you're shooting at f5.6, the camera will boost the ISO. It will drop the shutter speed to, there is some algorithms about what the minimum is that will give you. And that varies from camera to camera. So I can't give you a proper answer that a Sony camera will do this, a Canon camera will do this. They'll all do something slightly different, right? So let's say I'm in a dark scene. I pick an aperture of f5.6. The scene is too dark for 5.6 and ISO 100. So the camera will increase the ISO if you're in auto ISO mode, and it will drop the shutter speed to as low as it can get. Right? So that's how the basic algorithm works. Sagar asked what are S, CL, CHQ, QC modes in Nikon D810. So I had a Nikon D810, and I vaguely remember that S means single shot. That means if you press the button once, you get only one shot. If you change it to CL, that's continuous low. That means if you hold the button down, it takes multiple shots, but at low speed. CH is continuous high. If you hold it down, it goes, it takes a lot of frames. Q is quiet mode, I think. And QC is quiet continuous. That's what I remember, at least from when I had my Nikon D810. Okay. Are there any more questions about this before we move on? So please ask the questions. I'll go ahead and stop if we need to answer questions because the next topic is completely different from what we talked about. right? So I need to make sure that everyone is on the same page about these basic camera controls before we move ahead. The next topic is much more involved, right? So it's about autofocusing, and I'll have to take the camera off the tripod again. Okay, so there's an important question that I was asked offline. Okay, so uh, now that's going to be difficult to show you, but let me try. Okay, so I'm going to show you the back of my. I'm going to step away from this. I'm going to show you the back of my Nikon Z6. Okay, so this is the exposure my Nikon Z6 that my Nikon Z6 is suggesting for this scene. So it's suggesting 1 by 60, 1.8, and an auto ISO 640 ISO. Now, here's the deal. So I'm on aperture priority mode right now on this camera. Aperture priority mode is super important. It's what I use 99% of the time because I need to control depth of field. But now let's say that what the camera is suggesting to me, the exposure the camera is suggesting to me, let me just put that up here. And I'll demo this a little better later, but right now just keep this in mind. So let's say this exposure that the camera is suggesting is not accurate. It's not good, right? I need to make this brighter, but I'm in an automatic mode. So how do I make it brighter in an automatic mode? So that's where something called exposure compensation comes up. So if you see that there's a little plus minus thing, there's a plus minus button up here. This button here. There's a plus minus button, and I'll show it to you on the whiteboard in a second. You hold that down, and then you turn the dial. You can see now it's gone to +1, right? Now, what does this mean? It means that every single shot you take from this time onwards will be one stop brighter than the base exposure, right? You're telling the camera that what you suggested to me is one stop too dark. I want it to be one stop brighter. So now when I shoot this, you can already see the photo is much brighter. So it's suggesting, what is it suggesting to me now? If my Sony will focus on this. Yeah, so now it's suggesting ISO 1100 1250. It went from 640 to 1250, which makes sense. It's double the exposure, right? So I'm just going to put that on the whiteboard so you can see it, right? So this is called exposure compensation, right? It's indicated by this symbol, and it is calibrated in stops. So you can have -2, -1, 0, +1, +2, and you have intermediate values also. You have values in between. Um, So that's how you tell the camera in an automatic mode that, hey, whatever you're suggesting to me is not right. I want a different reading. I think that so if the camera is telling you that this is the right exposure, you can push back and say that, hey, I'm in P mode, I'm in A mode, I'm in S mode. I don't like the readings that you've given to me. So please give me better readings. Guys, sorry, just give me 1 second. My laptop's about to die because Leia unplugged it. Yeah. All right. Oh, yeah. All right. We're back online. So Parag asks, when does exposure compensation need to be changed? It needs to be changed based on what you decide. It needs to be changed whenever you think that the exposure that the camera is providing to you is not right. The readings that it's suggesting to you is not right. Right? So that's when you use exposure compensation. And exposure compensation is available in almost everything. So I'm just going to show it to you on my iPad. Right? So we just figure out a way to hold this properly. So let's look at exposure compensation on the iPad. Anurag, I'll just come to that in a second. I'm just going to show you exposure compensation. Okay, so this is exposure compensation, right? On the iPad. You can see that the sun thing going. There's a little logo of a sun going up and down. Let me just make that bigger, right? So that's exposure compensation. Let me just show you this in a proper app. Okay, so this is Lightroom Mobile. You can see on the bottom, I'm in the pro mode of Lightroom Mobile. There's an option for exposure, EXP. Right now it's at 0. So I can make this -1, I can make this +1, and I can make it 0. So these are exposure compensations. And exposure compensation is a really, really good tool because a lot of times you don't have time to use manual mode, right? You don't have time to actually figure out exactly what the shutter speed, what the ISO is. So you are going to be using an automatic mode. So when I shoot weddings, I'm almost always shooting aperture priority because I need to have perfect control of depth of field. I need to know that, if am I going to shoot this with shallow depth of field? Am I going to shoot this with wide depth, with deep depth of field? So I need to know these things. That's why I tend to prefer aperture priority. But now since I'm in aperture priority, I can't control how bright or dark the image is going to be. I can, but the only way I can is use exposure compensation. So I hope that makes sense. Um, okay, so everyone suggests. So Swapnil says, should we consider shooting in all these modes? Because everyone suggests to use your camera in fully manual mode to learn. Okay, so here's the deal. If when you're learning about exposure, it's very helpful to use manual mode, right? Because you understand that if I change the aperture by this much, the photo gets darker. If I change the shutter speed by this much, it gets darker. So when you're learning, my general recommendation is if you're learning, and that too, I mean by learning, I mean you're a beginner and you don't understand how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO change the exposure. If you're learning, use manual mode, right? Just use manual mode because until you get familiar with what these parameters do, it's really difficult to understand, right? So for in the beginning, just use manual mode. But after that, I feel like manual mode is a complete waste of time. And I'll explain why, right? So when you're using manual mode, uh, I'll show you how most people use manual mode. So I'm just going to bring my camera back off the tripod. Let me just get the camera off the tripod. Going to put this in manual mode. Okay, so now my camera is in manual mode. Now, notice there's a plus minus which shows +7. If I point it out of the window, it'll start saying it won't even give me a reading. It's so bright it can't tell me. It's gone past +2. So on most of your cameras, you'll have a little slider on the bottom, right? You'll have a little slider which goes plus and minus, right? So what most people do is, so look, I'm at 1 by 30, I'm at ISO 200, and I'm at f2.8. So what most people will do is it's saying +1. So they'll increase this until it becomes 0, right? So now it's 0, and then they'll take the shot. So what you're doing in manual mode is basically exactly following the camera's meter, right? So now notice the readings. It says 1 by 60, f2.8, 200. I'm going to change this to aperture priority mode. Notice the readings didn't change. So if I shoot now, I've shot exactly the same readings as manual mode, except it took me a minute to figure out the readings. In aperture priority, it's instant. I can just keep taking this photo immediately, right? So again, like let's go back to manual mode. Now the settings right now are good for the carpet here. This is not the carpet, this is layers blanket. So now let's point it at the window. Now it's too bright. Let me get the right reading for this. So I have to keep increasing the shutter speed, keep increasing the shutter speed, keep increasing the shutter speed. Now it's right. It's 1 by 800, 2.8 at ISO 200. Okay. Now I'm just going to change it to aperture priority. And you'll notice it's almost exactly the same reading. It's a little variation depending on where I'm pointing it, but it's basically the same reading. So I'm getting the same readings, but it's taking me almost no time to do it, right? So if you were using manual mode and just exactly following the camera meter anyway, then there's no point in really using manual mode. You should just use the program mode and you'll be fine, right? You can just use aperture priority and you'll be fine. All right, I'm just going to put the camera back on the tripod, right? Any more questions about this before we move on? The next topic is a little more involved. Can't we control exposure compensation in post? So Anurag, you can, but that's changing the exposure in post has a very solid limitation. Then you're fixed. Then the problem is something called dynamic range, right? Does your camera have sufficient dynamic range to make adjustments in exposure? And generally, for most cameras, you're only going to get about two stops up or down, maybe not even that much, depending on the scene. So the idea that you want to control the exposure and post is a very dangerous one, and I would try to avoid it. I would try to get very close to the required exposure in camera while you're shooting, just because you have severe limitations in how much you can adjust in post. Okay. When you use A mode, what happens if the shutter speed is very low? You know what happens, right, Omkar? So let's see. Let's say we're in A mode, right? I'm at ISO 200. I pick f2.8 on this lens. It can't get below f2.8, and now I'm getting 1 by 30, which is too slow. So what do I have left? The only thing I have left is ISO. So I start boosting the ISO. So let's say I want 1 by 60, then I'll use ISO 400. This will give me 1 by 60. If I go to 800, this will give me 1 by 125. Right? That's how you would solve the problem. Because you know that you only have three things to play with, right? You only have aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So because you only have those three things, your options are limited. It's easy to figure out, right? Yeah, there you go, ISO. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next thing. Now this is a super, super important topic. Now let me just put my whiteboard up, right? So I'm just going to put my whiteboard up. Let's talk about focusing, and specifically autofocus. Okay, so now let's talk about focusing and autofocus. Now, here's the deal. There are only two unrecoverable errors in photography, like unrecoverable technical errors in photography, right? Um, the first one is an un unintentionally blurred shot or unintentionally out of focus shot, right? There are only two unrecoverable errors. What do I mean by that? I mean, these are mistakes that cannot be fixed in post even to a small degree. Right? They're very difficult to fix even a little bit. If someone says, well, you can't fix exposure, you can. You can fix it to a decent degree. Like I was saying earlier, you have a couple of stops of latitude. It's called latitude. So you have a couple of stops of safety net in exposure, in post. You don't have any safety net when it comes to blurred photos. You have no safety net when it comes to out of focus photos. And notice I'm using the word unintentionally. It's perfectly fine. It's a perfectly legitimate use of camera techniques to have an intentionally blurred photo. So panning, half the photo is blurred. So that's intentionally blurred. Out of focus. So you could have like this dreamy out of focus look for a photo. If you intended to have it that way, then that's fine. That's an expression of your art. I think that's fine. But if it happens to unintentionally, then there's a problem. And if you remember from the last time session, we fixed this problem. We figured out a way to fix this problem. So what is a blurred photo? What causes a blurred photo? A blurred photo is caused by a low shutter speed, right? This is what causes a blurred photo. Now remember, this is a relative term, right? Blurred photos are caused by relatively low shutter speed, not just a low shutter speed. So let me give you an example of that. So if I'm shooting, there's Leia sitting right here. She's not moving at all, right? I could, if I shot her at one, remember the rule. If I have a 50 lens, I need to shoot at 1 by 50 or faster to remove the shake of my hand, right? To prevent this movement, my hand shaking, from blurring the photo. So I need to shoot this photo of Leia at 1 by 50 or faster on a 50 lens. Okay, so that's fine. Now let's take another extreme example. Let's say I was taking a photo of this is an F1 car. I'm here shooting this photo and it's moving in this direction. Now these cars do 300 kilometers an hour. It's going very fast in that direction. If I shoot that same photo at 1 by 50, which is a sufficient shutter speed for Leia, the whole car would just be a blur, right? It's not sufficient for the car. So you need a much higher shutter speed in this particular case, right? Much higher shutter speed. So for this, you might need 1 by 2000 to make this particular shot work, right? So blurred shots are cured by controlling your shutter speed. Right? That's the simple solution. So that's one problem fixed. Now we're going to be talking about the other problem, focusing. Right? So now let me just go ahead with the presentation. So just a little bit of an aside here. We are going to be leaning heavily into autofocus technology. We're going to talk a lot about autofocus technology today because All our cameras have it. Now, someone will say that someone told them that you have to manual focus all your cameras. Now, here's the reality of it. The reason why most people say that is because they read a book which was written in 1970, and they just started repeating what they read in that book. I've read the same book, right? In 1970, they didn't even have proper autofocus. Nowadays, we have autofocus, which is almost like voodoo. It's magic. The things that autofocus can do right now will completely blow your mind, right? And under 99% of circumstances, autofocus is faster and more accurate than you as a user of the camera. So in order for us, so we have these really nice expensive cameras. We are not paying money for all this technology to not use it. We're paying money so that the camera makes our vision easier to achieve, right? I don't want, when I pick up a camera, right, the last thing I want is to fight with the camera to make it take the photo that I wanted to take. I want to make the camera invisible. The camera should not impact how I conduct my business, or how I share my vision. So the camera should be transparent to me. It should not exist. All that exists is the photo that I want and my brain behind it. So I will do every single thing I can to make the camera do to do all the heavy lifting, the boring technical stuff. I'll make the camera do it. I'll try and avoid doing it. The less I have to think about the technical stuff, the more I can use my brain to think about the creative stuff. So that's how I like to approach it. And one of those things is focusing, right? So if I constantly am fiddling with the focusing ring to focus the camera, it takes away a lot of time. And in a lot of dynamic scenes, it doesn't work. So now going back to autofocus sensors, there are basically two types of autofocus technology in all cameras, right? Now, this is a little out of date. Most only use one type now, but I will just go over both types. So there's basically contrast detect and phase detect types of autofocus sensors, right? So these are the two types of autofocus sensors that you have. Now, most of your digital SLRs, and remember, I'm saying digital SLRs or mirrorless cameras, the current mirrorless cameras, they all have what's called phase detect technology. Now, to just give you a brief idea of how it works, I'm not going to go into the real technical detail. If you want, we can just do a whole session where we deep dive into the technical stuff. It's fun. I really enjoy talking about it, but it's probably not appropriate here. So this is a Canon 500D, and you can notice, there's a light path which goes in. There's a mirror. Everyone knows how a digital SLR works, I think. So there's a mirror which reflects the light, and that goes into the viewfinder of your camera. This is different from mirrorless cameras. Mirrorless cameras don't have, of course, they don't have a mirror, right? But below that, you notice there's another path of red light which is going downwards. So that's the autofocusing sensor. So in autofocus, let me just put up the whiteboard. So if this is the camera, this is the camera lens, right? And this is the camera body up here, right? Like this. This is the mirror of the camera. There's an autofocus sensor here. So what happens is when light enters, there's a pentaprism mechanism here, and this will be your eye looking at the photo. I'll just make that bigger. Right? So when light enters here, it goes into this path and goes into your eye. But a part of it, this mirror is partially reflective. So some part of the light goes down here, and this is the AF sensor, right? And this is for SLR cameras. It's different for mirrorless cameras, right? So this is how the AF sensor in a normal traditional SLR works, and this uses something called phase detect. Now, getting into this is fairly technical, but I'll give you a brief idea of it as we go ahead, right? So this is called phase detect. Phase detect requires a dedicated AF sensor of some kind. On mirrorless cameras, so in a mirrorless camera, it's like this. So same thing. I'm just going to draw the camera here. This is the lens. This is the camera. This is the sensor. In a mirrorless camera, this is the path of light. It goes to the lens and to the sensor. There's no mirror in the middle. And the sensor has AF has the AF sensor has the AF module built into it. So it uses something called focus pixels. So if this is the sensor, there are pixels in it dedicated. There are AF pixels or AF sensors built into the actual image sensor in a mirrorless camera. So it works a little differently. But both these use phase detect. So any modern mirrorless camera that you buy will use phase detect autofocus. There's a second kind of autofocus called contrast detect. Now, if you have any old point and shoot camera, new point and shoot cameras don't have this problem. So this is only applicable to old point and shoot cameras or old cell phone cameras. So this uses something called contrast detect. The idea in of contrast detect is really simple. The idea is that a sharp image has more contrast than a blurred image. So the camera will constantly keep changing the focus of the lens until it gets an image which is of maximum contrast. So that's how contrast detect autofocus works, right? So this is all technical in the weeds kinds, but we'll just go ahead and then we'll talk about it. This is just another diagram. This shows you how the autofocus sensor, the module is in a DSLR. Not, sorry, I just put that up here. This shows you how the autofocus module is in a DSLR. All this stuff is nice to know, but it's not very important from a practical point of view. I'm going to show you the practical part of this right now. Let me just get past this. Okay, so let's just make an assumption for now that what we're using is something called phase detect autofocus mode. Now, phase detect autofocus has significant advantages over contrast detect. It has advantages. So let me just put that up on the whiteboard. Phase detect versus contrast, right? Phase detect, which is what most of your cameras have, except if you have one of these older cameras and you put it in live view, like even a Nikon D750, if you put it into live view, then it starts using contrast detect. But as long as you're looking through the viewfinder of a digital SLR, you're going to be using phase detect autofocus. So phase detect is faster, always faster. There's a technical reason behind it. When we deep dive into this stuff, I can tell you about it. The second thing is that it generally works in lower light. Right? It's faster and generally works in lower light. Now, here's the problem with phase detect. If you looked at the diagram of phase detect, so look at this diagram of phase detect. You notice there's a different module, right? So there's a different module which handles the autofocusing. So uh, if this module is even slightly miscalibrated, like if the module is even slightly moved, and I'm talking about fractions of, like less than a millimeter. I'm talking about fractions of a millimeter. If it's slightly miscalibrated, that means that all your lenses will start misfocusing, or that a particular lens might not be exactly calibrated for this distance. Right? You can see the front of the lens, the blue front of the lens. If that lens distance is slightly wrong, right? If the lens is slightly the manufacturing tolerances, so if it's slightly off, it can start misfocusing. So in the beginning, someone asked me about having focusing issues. Sorry, this was a couple of sessions ago. Someone asked about having focusing issues with the 85mm 1.4. This is the reason why it happens. It happens because there could be miscalibration in the system, right? And then you have to recalibrate it. And there are many ways of recalibrating it inside the camera. Again, that's a topic best left for another day. The interesting thing is, so I'm just going to write down the disadvantages here. May be inaccurate, right? So what is contrast detect? Contrast detect is slower. It does not work well in low light. But it is extremely accurate, right? The reason why contrast detect is extremely accurate is that it doesn't need a dedicated sensor. It's actually analyzing the image. It's analyzing the image to see if something is in focus. So it's using the image as the feedback mechanism, right? So if the image is in focus, contrast detect says it's in focus. Right? That's why it works better in that situation. So if you have a lot of light and you don't care about speed, you can just use contrast detect. Nowadays, a camera like my Z6, right? This thing has a combination of these two systems. It's a complicated topic. Again, we'll talk about it later when we deep dive into this stuff. So I'm just leaving it for now. Okay. Now, moving on to focusing modes, right? Focusing modes. And I'm going to show you all these modes on my camera just in just a second. So there are basically three focusing modes that all cameras have. So they have AFS, which is single shot, AFC, which is AI servo, Canon calls it AI servo, and AFA, which is AI focus. I'll get to the questions that you have about focusing as soon as I finish this slide, and I'll just do a demo. Right, so these are the three modes of focusing that your camera has. Now, what do these modes mean? And I'll just demo it in a second. AFS is a mode which is used for objects which are static, which don't move relative to you, right? So it's a one-shot autofocus, which means that if you press the focusing button down, it will focus and it will show you a lock. It will show you that, hey, I've locked on, I've got this photo, this is in focus, and then you press the button. Now, by chance, if the subject moves after you've locked on, it cannot compensate for that. It's still stuck in the initial place it focused. That's why it's single shot. Once you hold the shutter button halfway, it will focus and lock on and not move the focusing plane again. Right? So that's single shot. AFC is called AI Servo for Canon, AFC for Sony and Nikon. AFC means that as long as you have the shutter button half pressed, anything which is underneath the focusing point, right, it will constantly refocus on it. If the subject moves closer to you, it will refocus. If the subject moves far away, it will refocus. And that's how it works. And AFA is something that I don't use, no one uses this. So AFA basically uses the camera's intelligence, and that's a big stretch calling it intelligence, uh, to decide whether AFC should be used or AFA should be used. So basically, what it does is if you use AFA or AI focus and you point it at a subject, uh, it will use AFS to begin with, and if the subject moves, it will immediately switch to AFC. That's the theory. Practically, it doesn't work. Right? It always makes mistakes of some sort. Right? So we normally use either AFS or AFC depending on the situation. And I'm just going to demo those two modes for you. Again, let me just pull the camera off the tripod. All right. Okay. So you should be able to see it here. Yeah. Okay. So right now, I'm just going to show you what mode we're in right now. Okay, you can see I'm on AFC. I'm going to just switch to AFA. Sony has a bunch of other modes and just ignore it. They're not really relevant. We're always either in AFC or AFS. We don't really use anything else. Okay, so I'm going to show you AFC. So watch what happens. I'm going to focus and it'll go green. That means it's locked, right? If I move, it loses focus lock, right? Sorry, this is AFA. I'm just going to change this to AFS. So this is locked, right? So watch this. I'm going to focus on the keyboard. I focus, but now I move, it'll go out of focus, right? If I move closer to it, it'll go out of focus. Why is that? Because it's still locked in the initial place where it got locked. So it got locked here. I got the photo, that will be locked. But if I move closer, it won't refocus. It'll just focus according to the initial state. All right, now let's try AFC. Now watch this. This is fun. Focus on the keyboard. As I get closer and closer and closer, it's still focusing. It's still focusing. It's still focusing. It's still focusing. Right? It's constantly going to try and keep whatever is underneath that bracket in focus. Now just ignore those multiple fancy blinking lights. I'll get rid of that to make it a little easier. Right? So see, it's constantly going to keep whatever is in focus. And if I move it up, it'll focus on that. Move it down, it'll focus on that. Right? So it's constantly refocusing. Now, why is this useful? This is great for sports photography, taking photos of the kids. So as long as you can keep something in the middle of this bracket, it'll stay in focus. Of course, you can also move the bracket around like this to get focus. Right? So you can do that too. Right? So this is how AFS and AFC work. Now you have AFA. We don't use AFA, so I'm not even going to bother talking about it. And of course, you have the old-fashioned way of doing this, which is full manual focus. This is manual focus now, right? So when I turn the ring, my Sony gives me magnification to get perfect focus, but most cameras will not let you do this. It's very, very difficult to manual focus a camera, especially a camera, a modern digital camera. They're not designed to be magnet focused. They're all designed to be autofocused. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my whiteboard. All right, guys. So I'm just going to stop for a couple of minutes and ask if there are any questions. So Pratik, basic principle of phase detect, it's it's difficult to tell you a basic principle. It's a long explanation. So I'll do that when we do a deep technical dive. Uh, what should be the ideal focusing mode? So it depends, Prachati. So it depends. If you're shooting a lot of action, then I would almost always be on AFC. There are different ways of doing it, and there are more advanced techniques of focusing. But in general, if you want, if you're focusing, if you're using, sorry, if the kind of photos you're taking are of moving subjects, I would almost always be in AFC. If you're shooting mostly static stuff, I would be on AFS. And the advantage of AFS, even though it doesn't refocus, is that it generally is more accurate. It won't keep constantly refocusing. So once you get locked, it's pretty solid. It's set. Right? So that's why we normally use AFS. Let me just write that down. Right? Okay. Yeah, I need to make a big list of all the stuff I'm going to talk about. Don't worry, I have a list. So all this stuff is all the technical stuff I have a big list of. It's The thing is, if I start bringing up all the complicated stuff now, it becomes super difficult to get through a simple topic. Why would we use AFA at all? Here, Omkar asked that question. Honestly, I don't use it at all. It's basically a newbie mode, right? It's for when you don't know what you're shooting. So if you say that you're shooting something which is suddenly going to start moving, then you'd maybe use AFA. But I wouldn't do that at all. If I know something, there's a chance of something moving later, I just use AFC. So I don't personally see the point at all of AFA. Vinayak asked, can AFS be the best one for landscapes? Yeah, landscapes are a good case for using AFC. Sorry, AFS. Harshad asked, how do you get 21 AF points works? I don't know what the question means. Harshad, could you just ask me that again in a different way, please? Swapnil says, tips for focusing in low light for nightclubs, bars, etc. Nikon screen shows AEL. What is that? So AEL is auto exposure lock. So auto exposure lock stops the. Oh, let me just change this to video mode. Sorry. Yeah. So autofocus. Sorry, AEL. So we're talking about AEL. This is auto exposure lock, right? So this means that if you notice when I was moving my camera, the exposure was changing, right? The exposure was changing when I was moving my camera around. So AEL is, let's say you figure out the best exposure for a scene, and you don't want the exposure to keep moving around, to keep changing, right? Because the camera will keep changing the exposure based on even slight changes in light. You hold down the AEL button, and that fixes the exposure, locks the exposure. Okay, so let me just go through these questions. Swapnil says tips for focusing in low light for nightclubs. So I'm just going to get to that, Swapnil. That's actually one of the important topics that I'm going to get to. So just give me a minute and we'll get to that part. Um, Prachati, what is your favorite focusing mode during wedding photography? So I use AFC almost all the time for weddings because I know the subject is constantly going to be moving. And so my technique is based around using AFC. And there are more advanced techniques too, like my Sony camera has eye focus, and there are lots of other ways of doing it, but all of those are used in the basic mode of AFC. AFC is covering both AFS and AFC. Yeah, AFC is basically a superset, but the reason you use AFS is if you think you're in a situation where AFC can go wrong. So, for example, there's something called focus pumping. So, what will happen is uh, AFC, if it can't get locked the first time, it'll keep trying to find focus, right? It'll keep trying to find focus and it might keep jumping around. So, if you're shooting something like a landscape, it might keep jumping around and you might get misfocused shots that way. So if you're sure the subject is static and you know that nothing is going to move, you can just use AFS, press the focus button, and then you're set. Chaitanya asked, do you use back button focusing? Yes, I use that all the time. I didn't bring it up because it's a more advanced technique, but my camera is always set to use back button focusing. I always use back button focusing. Harshad says, where should we focus when we shoot group photo? So that, Harshad, I covered in the depth of field thing here. So we talked about 5 minutes about how to do this. So just have a look at this video and you'll probably get your answer from there. So if I'm using back button for focus, then I keep it pressed when AI servo mode. Hemant, yes and no. Again, that's a more complicated answer. So again, that's something that is left for a more technical discussion. We'll get to it. But yeah, so if you're using the back button focus, you can just keep it on AI servo all the time. Yeah, so there is AF area mode in that single point and auto area. If I'm going to get to that, Piyush, we're going to talk about that. Niranjan asks, does mode work in aperture shutter priority mode? Yes, that's what it's for. AEL works in those modes. I see it keeps hunting for focus. Uh, okay. So now I'm going to, and Pratik says in portrait shoots where the model is fairly stationary, would you use AFS or AFC? So humans are never stationary, right? Even if the model is perfectly stationary, they're generally not stationary. So I tend to use AFC in those modes. I tend to treat it like any other moving subject. So I always use AFC. So now I'm going to show you a few more things about focusing before we move on to 1 second. Sorry, I lost the presentation. Yeah, before we move on to this part of it, which is the focus point size. Okay, so I'm just going to pull my camera off again. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to show you all the ways where focusing goes wrong or why it goes wrong. Okay, so all right, so we're in photo mode again. I have a pretty short HDMI cable, so I can't move this around too much, but I'm going to show you where it can't get focus. Okay, watch this, right? So I don't know if you can see this clearly. You see that yellow wall? I'm trying to focus on this yellow wall, and my camera is refusing to focus. I have the focus button pressed continuously. And this is the same case. This is on AFC. Let me just switch it to AFS so that you can see it's got the same problem. Right? It's not focusing. It can't focus on this. You see the flashing yellow, the green light? This means that it's very difficult for it to focus. It just can't, it's not getting focus lock, right? So let me go back to AFC. Now, why is that happening? No matter whether you're using contrast detect focus or whether you're using phase detect, you need contrast for it to catch focus, right? So watch this. So I'm going to point it. This didn't work, but this will work. That's almost immediate. This will not work, but this will work, right? So the problem here is that it needs contrast for it to catch focus. Contrast is super important for it to get focus. So anywhere in this scene, like this blanket, it'll immediately catch focus. It'll immediately catch. The curtain immediately. This immediately. The keyboard immediately. The table immediately. It'll all catch focus. But now when I point it at the wall, gone. It won't catch focus at all, right? If I want to get focus on the wall, I need to find something near the wall which has contrast, like this curtain. Then immediately I'll get focus, right? So this is the main limitation of autofocus. So autofocus requires contrast of some kind for it to work. So a lot of you might have faced this situation where you try and catch focus in a landscape photo and your focusing point is in the sky. It's pointed at the sky. So let's get this back. So when does autofocus stop working? Right? So autofocus, no matter what method of autofocus you're using, it needs contrast in the scene. It needs contrast in the scene to work. If there's no contrast, it just will not focus. Right? So the example I gave you was, let's say you're shooting a landscape photo. Right? This is the landscape photo. These are the hills and the mountains. There's a cloud up here somewhere. And you put your focus bracket here, right in the middle of a blue sky, right? This will not focus. This will not focus at all. Because in a blue sky, there's no contrast for it to catch. If there's no contrast for it to catch, it won't work, right? So so how would you fix this problem, right? All you would do is just try and catch focus on the cloud here somewhere, right? On the edge of the cloud or on top of the mountain, something like this, right? And those subjects are really far away, so they'll all be captured in the depth of field, so it should be fine, right? So this is the way to solve the problem. Now, someone asked, what happens in a dark club or a dark room? So what happens in a dark room? If you think about it, right? If you have a situation in a dark room, very dark rooms are are they situations of high contrast or low contrast? They're always situations of low contrast. Right? So dark rooms are generally situations where there's very little contrast. So it's difficult to get autofocus. Autofocus generally fails in those situations. So what you're looking for in a situation like a dark room or a dark club or a bar is edges of contrast. So if you have a person who's got his cell phone screen on, you'll notice it'll immediately catch focus on a cell phone screen. If you notice there's a light shining on some guy in the middle, everything else is dark, but there's light shining on one guy in the middle, it'll immediately catch focus. So that's how you would actually try and get focus in a darker room. Now, if you're in a wedding scenario, right, that's a completely different topic. So in a wedding scenario, what we tend to do is we have flashes with autofocus assist lights. So what that does is it throws a pattern of light on the subject, and then the autofocus system can catch that pattern. So that's how that works. But both of those things require contrast. This is your solution to any focusing problem that you may have, right? So if you have contrast in the scene, autofocus will work. If you don't have contrast, it just does not work, right? So uh, think about astrophotography, right? The subjects are very dim and very far away. So because they're so dim, there's no contrast. So it's very difficult to get autofocus lock onto a star. You just can't do it. So in those situations, that's where you use manual focus. You try and manual focus. You use live view and then you manual focus on a star. Right? So does that answer those questions so far? Okay. So now let's move on to the AF point sizes. Right? So let's talk about this. Sorry, let me just go to my presentation. Okay. So this is an example of I think this is a 5D Mark III, right? So you can see there are cameras which have either very few or many autofocusing points. And these are all SLR. So I believe the 5D, I don't remember how much the 5D Mark III had. I think it had 60 something autofocusing points. It's very common now to have cameras with 50 autofocusing points. I think the D750 has 51 autofocusing points or something of that sort, right? So each one of these is autofocusing points, and you can select each one of those autofocusing points. But remember one thing, not all autofocusing points are the same. Not all autofocusing points are equally good at getting focus lock. So there's the idea of having the two basic kinds of points. There are basically three. There are vertical points, which is a very weird name, I know. There are vertical type, I should just call it vertical type points. Then there are horizontal type, and then there are cross type. Okay, so there are the three different types of points. Now, what does this mean? It means that when you have a vertical point, so in your autofocusing sensor, right? If this is an autofocusing sensor, your vertical point is like this. It's vertically oriented. So what does that mean? It means that it cannot detect vertical lines. It can only detect horizontal or inclined lines of some sort because that's the only way it'll find contrast, right? The next one is the horizontal type. The horizontal type is oriented like this. It can, and you can see it on the diagram. Let me just put that up there. Right, the horizontal type can only detect vertical contrast. And then you have cross type. Cross type are basically like this. They can detect both horizontal and vertical contrast in a scene. So let me give you an example. So if I had a camera which only had vertical type points, and I put this pencil in front of it, it would not be able to get autofocus lock on this easily, right? Especially if it is far away, because it has it's oriented along with the focusing point, so it doesn't see the contrast. Whereas if I tilt this pencil, it'll immediately be able to get focus lock. Now here's the thing about this. Almost all DSLR cameras have these three types, but most DSLR cameras only have cross type in the center. The more expensive ones, if you look at the diagram in front of you, all the orange ones are cross type, but they're all clustered in the middle, right? There are some cross type on the side, but this is a very expensive camera, right? This one was a 5D Mark III. It was like a 2.5 lakh camera when I bought it. But the cheaper ones will only have the cheaper ones will look a bit like this, right? Most of the entry level cameras will have very few focusing points. They'll have something like this. They'll have some focusing layout like this, right? Now in these situations, it's a guarantee that the center point will be crossed. No guarantee for any of the other points. Right? That's a guarantee. So, which means that if you want the maximum chance of being able to get focus lock, you should be using the center point of the camera. Now, this, of course, only applies to digital SLR cameras. Mirrorless are completely different. Mirrorless work in a different way. Mirrorless have some weird limitations and some weird advantages. Right? Any questions about this? Oh, it looks like there's some weird lag in the video. I'm sorry. I don't know why this is lagging. Guys, can you see the video coming up clearly? Sorry, guys. It looks like the video is lagged. Um, Let me just see if I can figure out some way to fix it. So it looks like it's not, I don't know why the video is lagged. Apparently the audio is coming through clearly, but the video is laggy. Uh, I don't know why that's happening, honestly. It looks fine from the broadcasting tool I'm using is giving me feedback that the stream is fine. I don't know why that's happening. So let me see if I can figure out some way to fix this. Okay, so we're almost at the end of the presentation anyway. So if you can all hear me, then we'll just stop using the presentation. I can just talk through it. So just keep asking your questions. I'll respond to them here. If you can all still hear me. Okay, Ajay says I have an Nikon Z camera and whenever I'm using it in low light conditions using flash on off camera. So Ajay, that's a difficult. One second. Sorry, it looks like the video stopped working at all. Done. Okay, so let's just forget about the video. It's the presentation's over anyway, so we can just forget about the video for now, right? So uh, so let's just take a few questions until we wind up for today. I apologize, I don't know what's going wrong. So let's look at Ajay's question. I have a Nikon Z camera, and whenever I'm using it in low light conditions using flash, it doesn't throw illuminate. So that's a peculiar problem with mirrorless cameras. So the red light which goes out with the flash autofocus assist does not work with mirrorless cameras. So what we tend to do when we have that situation is we use a little flashlight. I have a little torchlight which I throw onto the subject to get autofocus lock. So that's how we do it. It works pretty well in most cases.